Hey, welcome back to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast with your hosts, Brent Aiken and Russell Martin. We are glad that you're joining us today, and we hope that you find this conversation helpful, insightful, and encouraging as you lead your students in ministry. We wanted to stop and remind you about our social media. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at TalkStudentMen. And then you can also go to our website, studentministryconversations.org. Today, we're going to hear an interview with Brock Morgan, and he is going to share a little bit about the future of youth ministry. Russell, now this was your conversation, so can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I'm going to be short because I really want you to hear what he has to say. But Brock Morgan and I talked about the future of student ministry, what is coming, what the possibilities are, where he sees God moving and where he sees ministry moving, and the outlook for what that looks like. And so it's a great conversation, some great insights, and some great things to think about as we move forward.
Man, that sounds awesome. And I'm super excited for this episode. So without any more delay, here's Russell's conversation with Brock Morgan.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the Student Ministry Conversation podcast. And we are thoroughly excited here. Brock Morgan is with us, and he has done ministry for a long time in student ministry and is an author and a speaker. And so we're just going to pick his brain this time a little bit about youth ministry and the past of youth ministry and the future of youth ministry. And so before we get started, or as we get started, Brock, could you just you can take a 10,000 foot view. You can go back as far as you want, whatever you want to do, but just kind of give us a history of where you were and how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I am so excited to be with you. I've been looking forward to this for, I don't know, maybe you asked me a couple months ago. And
at April, I was at my niece's wedding in April, I think. And I saw that. So
I'm sitting in our youth room, and I am a youth worker at a church. And it's funny. The big view of kind of the story is I was born, and my parents I was born in the 70s, and my parents were in a Christian rock band. And so I grew up the first 10 years of my life, 6 months out of the year on a tour bus. And my parents were playing rock and roll, and it was the heart of the Jesus movement. So like every week, I was this kid who saw all of these hippies coming to know Jesus. It's actually the last revival we've had in our country was in the 70s, Jesus movement. And so like my parents' band were pretty big. They had a top 10 hit on secular radio. And then they were doing for a few years all of the Billy Graham crusades, the youth nights. And so that was like an exciting beginning. And then my dad became a youth pastor. And so I grew up in a youth pastor's home for the next 10 years of my life after that. And then my dad was demoted like you and became a lead pastor. So I grew up in a home that was actually fairly radical, lovers of Jesus, lovers of kids. And so when I was 18, started doing youth ministry right out of high school, just like you, and loved it. And I've been doing it now for about 29, 30 years, if you can believe it. And I'm still doing I just started a new youth ministry. It's like this brand new church in Southern California. It was kind of our opportunity to go build a church. And so now I'm the associate pastor, and I oversee outreach, and I run the day-to-day youth ministry stuff. I'm the only paid youth worker in our church, and just doing it, man, setting up every week. And then I also speak a lot on Sunday mornings in the main services. But yeah, that's kind of the big view.
Awesome. Well, I mean, do we know, like, can you tell us your parents' group?
Yeah, the band was called the Amplified Version. The song that was a hit on the radio not Christian radio, but
Yep.
secular radio was the Gadget Man, and they actually were too heavy, so the church would burn their records like outside of the Coliseums. They'd be, it was just, the 70s were a different time. I mean, we think of like Amy Grant crossing over in the 80s and people were all upset about that. This was even before that. It actually was Billy Graham who legitimized them in the church's eye. So at the last concert they ever did was at the Crystal Cathedral with, what's his face? Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, I can't think.
Oh my gosh, what's his name? Anyway, national TV Sunday morning thing. But dude, I can't remember his name. Anyway,
we'll look it up and put it in the notes.
Yeah, totally.
Well, you've written several books, and so I kind of went back and looked at. I did not read all the way through them, but I plan to. But you talked about youth ministry in post-Christian world in 2013. Yep. You wrote, and then one of the things you have is the vision for youth ministry. And there's one in between that, wasn't there? Oh, no, in 2019, Beautiful Rebellion.
Yeah.
So there seems to be this kind of progression with each of those books. So can you kind of just, you don't have to go into the details of each of them, but can you talk a little bit about that youth ministry in a post-Christian world? What is post-Christian for somebody who's kind of heard that, but I'm sure there's some who still don't quite know that, but just kind of go through a little bit of that, what you talked about in that first one.
So I the first book I ever wrote was a parenting book called Parent's Guide to Teenage Guys. And
was that with Marco?
That was, I co-wrote that with Marco. And I just felt honored to oh my gosh, I have an opportunity to write a book. And it was because of Marco. And then I was speaking at an event about the world of youth and kind of what is going on in culture right now kind of talk. And I started talking about post-Christianity. And I got off the stage after that talk. It was at a youth conference thing in the main stage. And a couple publishers came up and said, hey, you should think about turning that into a book. Again, I wasn't thinking about anything. But from that, we turned it into a book. And post-Christianity really, these days, now that it's been a few years since I've written it, most people, it's like a no duh that we're living in a post-Christian world. But really, post-Christianity is just the culture that emerges as the Christian faith loses maybe coherence, clarity within a society that was initially shaped by Christianity, Judeo-Christian kind of ethic. And then as those Christian structures decline in influence, other voices rise up and they start shaping conviction and influence in that world. And so we've seen that what is shaping our world today is no longer Christian. And so now we're living in a post-Christian world. It was in the 1950s that C.S. Lewis first said that England at that time, Europe at that time, was in a post-Christian world. We have been really behind. And I think that C.S. Lewis, when he said that, it was just emerging, but he felt okay, we're now in post-Christianity. America has been behind, but it's been progressively moving that way probably since the 80s, especially into the 90s. And of course, more recently, I think it's full on. Even if you're in the South Bible Belt area, maybe the adults are still kind of, they grew up in the Christian world, mindset, worldview, but their children aren't. And so it has emerged.
That's interesting. You just brought up that last part of, and I'll kind of wrap this into one question, but so the question is, what are some of the, is it a good thing or a bad thing? What are some of the opportunities or obstacles? But I think it's interesting when you said that, especially here in the South, so I'm in Houston, Texas. You have adults who are living in this, grew up in a Christian world, and you have students who are definitely growing up, in a post-Christian world, their worldview. So with all of that, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Or there's some opportunities or obstacles? What's kind of both sides of growing up in that and doing ministry in that?
I think it's both good and bad. It's good in that there's a great opportunity for the church to really be light. The good news is remarkable because it's actually good news. And a world that moves away from Jesus discovers slowly, whoa, this doesn't work as well. And so the church has a real opportunity to be salt and light in an ever increasing, the world is maybe getting darker and darker in some regards. And there's good things, that are happening in the world when you think of a growing diversity and an awareness of minorities and their struggle. Like there's some really good things that are happening in the world right now. But when we talk about post-Christianity, what I have discovered that is so amazing, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I would talk about the way of Jesus to students. I would talk about how there's two roads. You can pick Jesus talked about the road that leads to death and the road that leads to life. And I remember kids being like, I don't know if I believe that. Like, I just don't know. I'm not seeing that. Kids today go, wow, the way of the world isn't working. My parents are a mess. My older siblings are a mess. I'm struggling. All my friends are miserable. We're all overwhelmed with anxiety and fears and brokenness and addictions. And this isn't working. I don't know if the way of Jesus is the right way, but I do understand that the way the culture is going isn't working. And so I actually have never been more hopeful, because kids have never been more open. And I've been doing this a long time.
Yeah.
So I think that's an incredible opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting to think about, is because I remember, I've been doing youth ministry, I guess about the same amount of time you have.
Yeah.
And just to look and see, because, when I was in the youth group, or the fact that it isn't working, we've seen the progression of a cycle of it going through and not being, valid or not working, as opposed to, like you said, when you would ask them and they'd be like, I'm not sure. But now we're living on that side of it.
We're on the other side of it. And so you have places in like England and parts of Europe and Africa, Asia, that are literally having revival right now. And they're not even calling Europe post-Christian anymore. They're calling it pre-Christian, because they are seeing this emerging movement, especially of young people right now. I'm so jealous of my British friends. They'll post on Facebook, 800 kids got saved last night. And they're posting this stuff every week. I'm like, oh my gosh, man, I can't wait till we get there. We're about 10 years behind them. And so, yeah, that's actually what led to my next youth ministry book, which was Youth Ministry 2027, which was this idea of moving kids from doubt to faith and into a movement. And it's taken out of John 20:27. And so how do we, now that our kids are in the midst of this post-Christian world, we already wrote about that in youth ministry in a post-Christian world, and it is practical, but I wanted to kind of go part two. Okay, what's the next step in moving kids actually into a movement? And so it actually happened because I'd been calling kids, this generation, the Thomas generation. They're quick to doubt, but they have tender hearts and they just want to know what's true, like Thomas. Like, they want to know personally that Jesus is alive and real, and he is who he said he was, and so but they can't just take it because their parents believed it. They want to see this for themselves. And so I've been calling them the Thomas generation. And I was like, man, wouldn't it be cool My friend told me in England, he said by 2027, he's a futurist in that he kind of reads culture and he understands the coming trends. He said by 2027, Brock, the US will have a revival among young people. And I was like, wouldn't it be cool if somewhere in the gospel, chapter 20, verse 27, Thomas moved from doubt to faith and into a movement? And I opened the Bible to John chapter 20, verse 27. And there Jesus is looking at Thomas saying, leave your doubt and believe. Put your hand in my side. And I was like, oh my gosh, I got it, baby. Like, here we are. Chapter 20, verse 27 of John. We've got a book title. Anyway, so that's the next youth ministry book I wrote. And it's all about, all right, how do we, if there's a movement coming, and I don't know if there is, but at least how do we instigate a movement? How do we move kids from doubt to faith and into a movement, which is what our faith is? It's a movement of God working. And it's not just a movement of an intellectual kind of, I'm saved, I get to go to heaven now. It's a movement of amazing things on earth, in heaven, on earth as it is in heaven. And so we're bringing heaven everywhere we go. That's the movement. And so that's Youth Ministry 2027. So there's two down.
That's kind of what's in my head when you're talking about that, though, is it something that we can help bring about? Is it something that's going to come no matter what, naturally? Or is it something, when you talk about it, it happened, we follow a cycle in Europe. So, like, give me thoughts on whether it's something that's just going to naturally happen, or are there things that we need to do? And you've obviously put into the book some of the things that we need to do.
Yeah, totally. There are some things that we can do that could either ruin it, sabotage it, or it could instigate it. We could easily not have one because of how we respond to the tender hearts of kids, the openness of kids. This is an incredible opportunity. If you look at the 70s Jesus movement, I saw it firsthand. I mean, I was a kid, but basically how this movement started outside of the church. And then the church was like, we want to get in on this. So they started, and it was in the 70s that youth ministry became a professional, like churches started en masse hiring youth workers. It was late 70s, early 80s. And basically what we told these hippies was, you got to cut your hair and put some shoes on and take a bath, and you got to behave. And it became moralism. It was Pharisaical. And so the faith became about cleaning these people up and turning them into us. And it stifled this out of control movement that was happening, and it was messy. It was messy. And there was even pros and cons to that, but the pros were the move of God was happening in the hearts of minds of students by hundreds of thousands. It was insane. My parents, there's this movie that was put out a few years ago called Woodlawn. Have you ever heard of that? It's about it's the kid from Goonies, and he's also in Lord of the Rings. Anyway, I can't remember his name. We're having problems with details in this conversation, people's names. But anyway, the Lord of the Rings guy, he started a movie about this Youth for Christ. It's a true story. Youth for Christ guy in the 70s goes to this local high school and starts telling them about Jesus. The football team, they all get saved. And then the cheerleaders, and then they start holding Bible studies and prayer meetings. And all of a sudden it's the whole school. And then it's another school. And then it's another school. And he doesn't know, he's overwhelmed with this overwhelming, it's in Mobile, Alabama that this happened. And the real story is he's overwhelmed with how many kids are coming to know Jesus. And it's at this point, like thousands. And so he calls my dad up, who's the leader of this Christian rock band, and says, "Hey, could you come and do a concert? I just want someone to come in who gets kids and can minister to them." So my parents are booked for one show. They bring their band in, and all these kids get saved. So much so, and the response is overwhelming that he's like, "Can you do it again tomorrow night?" They end up staying for a month, and every night they do a new show. So 30 shows in a row. During the day, they're going to schools and doing school assemblies. And they had this whole region of kids, thousands of kids. This is what was happening. And we weren't equipped as the church to deal with this many young people coming to know Jesus. And so we just decided to clean them up and make them like us and have them sit in rows and listen to people talk about the faith versus being out there reaching their friends. And I don't know, it was just a really interesting thing. So you look at what's happening right now. We're not anywhere near that happening in the States, but that is happening right now in Europe. And what can we do? And I think a couple of things when we think about this opportunity. The first, I think of being more prayerful. If you kind of look at the history of the move of God, it begins with a couple people just on their knees every day praying. Prayer kind of moves, it instigates this movement when people get serious about prayer and they invite students into it. And prayer I discovered about 10 years ago that our youth ministry did announcements longer than we prayed at youth group. And I was so convicted by that. Oh my gosh, like we've got to make prayer like a thing that, like, if we're not teaching kids how to talk with God, what the heck are we doing? And so I started actually teaching kids how to pray. And then I started teaching them how to pray for their friends. And then I started having them up front where kids could come to these kids, like these kids are staying up front at the end of my talk, and they could come and get prayed for by their peers. And it got to the point where our youth group was like mad at me if we didn't end where they could pray for each other. And they're just so open to this stuff, but we're so stuck in kind of our old youth ministry models. And so we decided to make prayer king. Like, that's a priority. Secondly is I thought we got to go deeper. Like, shallow Christianity no longer resonates, not even in evangelism. Like, even kids who don't give a rip about the gospel, if you just give them, funny stories and a little Jesus, dude, that's not resonating. And so kids are longing for thoughtful, it's this deeper intellectual stuff. And so I give a little more meat in my messages. And then we also, because of the prayer stuff, we're wide open to the Holy Spirit. So it's bringing intellect and heart together. So we're praying, we're open to the Holy Spirit, and we're giving them meat. And I found that those things started to instigate something in the hearts and minds of our students. And so that just kind of off the top of my head, those are some things we started doing that has started to have impact. Even in this brand new church I'm in, I noticed our church we have a brand new building. We just launched in January, and I discovered that we're on the edge of this neighborhood and we're right next door to 7-Eleven. So we were having like 200-300 teenagers walking through our parking lot every day to go to 7-Eleven to get a Slurpee. And so like I bought some skate ramps. We're in Southern California. It works great. And all of a sudden our youth group, our little group has just exploded, and I'm not giving them shallow stuff. We're hanging out. We're having a ball. We just had a surf camp, but man, we are teaching these kids who don't have a clue how to pray, how to be open to the Holy Spirit. how to think through life's biggest, most complex questions. We're giving them the meat of the gospel. And so this is going to ready our kids if a movement happens. And so, I just unloaded a bunch of stuff on you.
No, that's good. And I didn't know if, had a few questions to ask, and I know you have a lot of stuff you've talked about. And so I was going to let you go kind of wherever you wanted. I did see a talk you did for the summit in 2012.
Yeah.
And you talked about these buzzwords. And they're still buzzwords we use today, tolerance and relativism and spirituality and mission. And so I just I don't know if you remember anything from that, but I kind of thought about that, and when I watched it, I liked that, redefining some of those things, and one of the things,
I can totally talk about those things, but go ahead.
No, I was saying, just if you're thinking along those, I know it was 2012, so I don't know if any of that's changed or how that's changed in the past. So what is it about those things that sparked you to redefine those for the church?
Yeah, I feel nervous about where the church is currently right now, with especially the political environment. And where the world is, and the intolerance. And so when I was, so this is 2012, this is way before all this stuff. I saw this stuff coming, and I was saying that we needed to embrace tolerance. And what I mean by tolerance is a humble posture, a willingness to listen and learn, and to allow people to think differently than us. And so at the time, I got some heat over this talk. So I talked about tolerance. I talked about Christian relativism. I picked these buzzwords because I knew they would make the listener a little uncomfortable. But like Christian relativism, there's this idea that I got from Brian McLaren, who wrote a book called Generous Orthodoxy. And he talked about how there's enough room for diversity of thought within the church. And a few years later, I'm starting to hear these kids who are living in this emerging post-Christian world, and they're asking these questions, and they're basically seeing the church, and they're like, hey, I don't think I could be a Christian anymore. Why can't you be a Christian anymore? Because of how hateful they are towards homosexuals, or because of, you can name your topic, right? Or because of their understanding of the Bible being perfect and inerrant, or whatever it is. You can just name your hot topic that a kid, I can't believe anything because of the church stance on this. Well, the idea is that there are some things that that the reason why the church is divided over these issues is because maybe they're not super clear. Maybe there are a few pillars in the faith that unites us, Jesus being one of them. If you think about the main things, creation, regardless of how long it took, but God created the world. Man rebelled, so creation fall. Redemption, we're talking about the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. And then final restoration, that Jesus will one day, God will come and make all things right. He'll restore all things. Those are the kind of the four pillars of the grand narrative of the faith. Those are, we can all agree, every Christian can agree on those four pillars. For me, everything else is kind of, we got to be humble about it. Women in ministry, homosexuality, whatever it is. And so I would let kids off the hook, and I would talk about how actually orthodoxy is big and it's broad. and there's diversity of thought on those issues. You, as a United Methodist pastor, are in the midst of all of this stuff. And I'm certain that there are kids going, well, wow, if the church believes that, then I can't be a Christian. And I want to say to them, actually, no, you can be a Christian because there's room for you. Orthodoxy is big, it's broad, it's wide. And there are a lot of things that we just don't know about. And so we have to have a humble posture. Me saying this in 2012, dude, I took some heat. They had to turn the comment section off on YouTube because they were killing me. And at this conference, I gave this stuff at. And so for me, when a kid is like, I can't agree with you on that, I want to say, you don't have to agree with me on that. Many Christians don't, or whatever the issue is. And I've got to be open-handed about some of these things. I just don't think that when we stand before Jesus on Judgment Day, he's going to ask us, so did you believe the Bible was inerrant or not? I just don't, I don't think that's going to be one of the pillars he asks us about. And so we've got to, it's relative. Some of these things are relative. They're important. We got to wrestle. We got to figure it out. They're important, but they're not heaven and hell issues. And so, so that was from there anyway.
Well, something else you mentioned there, and you've talked about, I think, in a couple other places, was mission over programs. And it probably kind of goes into, what I wanted to make sure we talked about was, we've done things one way in the past, and it may have worked great for a while in some of those things, but at some point we kept doing things the way we'd always done them, and the culture changed, and we didn't make that, shift to, we grew apart, our methods grew apart from who we were trying to reach and the way we'd always done it, because we'd always done it this way. But, Generation X, the next generation is Generation Z and millennials, and I can't even think of the next one. My son's part of it. They haven't agreed on a name yet, but each of those have different needs, different ways of thinking, different worldviews, different information. We went from before the iPhone to after the iPhone, which was a huge shift in information and kids fact checking what you're talking about and all those things. So you have the old way of doing it, and then you have this progression that we had, slowly looking for new ways. Something I think about is how many kids have doubts and how the church doesn't really accept doubt. It's like, you need to know what it is. And like you talked about, there's no chance to let's wrestle with this. And I see a lot of kids, talk about moving away from the faith or the whole deconstruction movement and all these things. And it's like, a lot of the things they're talking about are things I have thought. I mean, I question, but if you're in the church and the church, you have to have it all right, then there's no room for somebody to ask a doubt or a question.
Yeah, doubt is so vital to our faith. It's questions are better than answers. The question causes me to be a seeker, and there's so much goodness in seeking. The opposite of faith, Anne Lamott said, the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. And when we create an environment where students can experience the warmth of God in the midst of where they are at, wherever that is, in the midst of questions and struggles and doubts, maybe issues on identity, whatever it is, we are creating an environment where they, through us, experience the reality that God is very fond of them. And he loves the way their mind works. And he loves, and he's not threatened by their questions. And neither should we be. So I remember being 15 and I was at youth group, and I got in trouble, me and my buddy, for goofing off during the youth pastor's talk. And so the youth pastor afterwards asked me and my friend, hey, come into the church kitchen. I want to talk to you. So he confronts us. And my buddy felt, I guess, a little rebellious. and was like, you know what? I don't even think I'm coming back here anymore. In fact, I don't even believe this stuff anymore. And I looked at him and I was like, underneath my breath, I was like, you don't? You don't? Like, what? Okay. He's like, yeah, I don't even believe this stuff and I'm not coming back anymore. And the reality is he didn't. Like, he just stopped coming. But I went home that night thinking, his name was Camilo. I was like, does Camilo know something I don't? Like, should I be questioning this stuff? And so quietly, I started questioning the faith. And it was quiet because I didn't want anyone to know that all of a sudden, Camilo's like, I don't believe this stuff. I'm like, well, maybe he knows something I don't. So I started questioning also. And so I started quietly struggling through these kind of bigger life questions and questions of faith. And does God really exist? And is his name Jesus? And how can that even be true? And after about a month, I had a really good relationship with my dad. After about a month, I went to him and I was like, hey, I've been having these questions. And I told him. And my dad looked at me and he was like, oh my gosh, Brock, I've been waiting for you to ask these questions. Finally, your faith is becoming your own. You're beginning the process of what that is, which is wrestling through these important, vital questions. I'm so proud of you. And I remember thinking, what? It made my dad created an environment where my questions and my struggles and my doubts were I was not just safe to have them, they were celebrated. And for me as a youth worker, that really set the stage for the environment I wanted to create. So I view youth workers and parents and any adult who is in the life of the kid, the keeper of the questions. They make sure the questions stay alive. They make sure the questions keep getting asked. And we don't quickly squash questions. We don't run from questions. We don't just give them a pat answer so they stop asking the question. We allow them to take the long road that questions take us through, that long path, because it really, if it's done right, oh my gosh, you've got a dangerous follower of Jesus to the systems and the small thinking of this world. Now they are thoughtful and ready for the world. You don't have to fear them going to college and losing their faith, because the first time they've started in a safe environment asking these questions. They're asking the questions at home. They're asking these questions in the midst of youth group, where someone is there with them, guiding them, like a tour guide, pointing out things that they would have missed otherwise. And so that's our role.
Maybe other questions too. And
other questions too. Yeah.
Well, something as I saw you wrote the future, the 2027 book, and then, so you had this idea of the future of youth ministry in 2017 and what's coming up, and then 2020 hit. So I do want to kind of get a little bit. Did this past year change or cement or accelerate any of your thinking or ideas? If you were writing that book today, what would you do differently, or what maybe has? What thoughts did this bring about? And then also, what did this reveal about either your ministry or churches in general and youth ministries in general?
Yeah. So Beautiful Rebellion is a book I wrote for kids. And publishers, it's hard to get a book published that's written for kids. Because publishers are convinced that kids don't read. And so I convinced my publisher that I could write a book that maybe even kids would want to read. And so I wrote it, of course, no idea about 2020 coming and what that would mean. And I just think that 2020 revealed even more so the need for a beautiful rebellion. it showed the ugliness of our world. So you have the political divisiveness, division that is happening all around the world, not just in the US. It's insane. It's disheartening. Churches splitting over this kind of stuff. It's awful. You have the racial horrible stuff with the racial divide and what's happening with the police department and that whole thing. Oh, and then let's throw in fires and oh yeah, and we have a world pandemic. So like the pandemic, I think, ushered in this. It was this perfect storm of all of these things colliding and revealing how broken we really are, how desperate we are for a new move of God. And so this beautiful rebellion is a book that's calling kids to instigate a movement. And I just think it's never been more, I just feel like it's perfect. It was written, just before it came out, just before this pandemic and just before 2020. And it was like God orchestrated. And so we have kids are reading this book all over the country, and it feels more relevant than ever before. And again, like I said, when we started this conversation, I just feel like kids are looking at the world and they feel hopeless, and anxiety levels are through the roof. Suicide is higher than it's ever been. Since 2010, suicide among teenage girls is up 73%. That's insane. Suicide rates among teenage boys is up 40%. Suicide rates among preteen kids is up 123%. The world isn't working. And so we have to invite these kids who are desperate to be a part of something that is beautiful, to be a part of something that's bigger than themselves. It's called transcendence. Every human, especially kids, have this longing to be a part of something transcendent, to be a part of something larger than themselves. And we as the church have to invite them into a movement that actually is bringing good news to the world, meeting felt needs in the community, being salt and light, not getting caught up in the political systems, but being the peacemakers of the culture, of the world, standing in the middle of this divide and calling people to love, calling people to a life that where they could actually flourish. And so I just think it's an amazing time for the church, and an amazing time for the church to get something right for once.
Well, that's something that I've asked I've asked business leaders and teachers and a lot of different pastors, what are the things that you stopped doing during the pandemic that you will never start again? And what are the things you started doing during the pandemic that you'll never stop? But along with that is, the idea of that is I don't want to miss an opportunity. And so you talk about this opportunity coming, you talk about the beautiful rebellion, you talk about the church getting it right. So kind of as one of the final questions is, as a pastor, as a youth leader, as a church, how do we make sure that we don't miss this, that we don't get frightened by kids rebelling in the way you're talking about and taking hold of this? How do we embrace and be ready and just take this opportunity that's coming and empower and equip and encourage students for this and what's coming?
Yeah, I think I go back to Like if you have a listener who maybe they have a heart for students, but they're not necessarily a youth worker, but they're a parent maybe, or a grandparent, or maybe they're a pastor or a leader in the community, and they have a real heart for this generation and the difficulty that kids are going through today. I would just call them into a life of prayer. That would be step one. And this is not a trite little he has to say that kind of thing. When my daughter was born, before my daughter was born, we have one kid. She's 24 now, and she is a prayer warrior. And the reason is because when she was a baby in the stroller, my wife and I would finish dinner, walk out the door, and go for a prayer walk. We've been doing this for 26 years, our entire marriage. And then Danson would go with us as she grew up. And so she grew up learning how to seek God every single night in prayer. And because of that, she's seen the hand of God work. And so the first thing I would say is, will you please join us in prayer? Like, let's run after God together. If there was a movement of prayer that just started happening where families, individuals, couples, whatever it is, after dinner went outside and just started praying over their community, I just wonder what God would do. I just happen to be one of those weirdos who believes that God is longing for his people to seek him and longing to work in the world and has a heart for the world. And we have an opportunity to join him in prayer, kind of brings our hearts in line and our minds in line with God. And so the first thing I would say is can we please just make prayer a priority? And then I would change our perspective on one thing. You look at the world. I was just thinking about this with your question. It's easy to look at the world and fear. If we are a praying people, if you look at the early church, when they started encountering suffering, this is a pre-Christian world, the early church. It's amazing to think pre-Christian. That means it became a Christian. They eventually won. They actually won Rome over. The very group of people who were hanging them on crosses, burning them at the stake, doing everything they could to stop the movement of Jesus. And when these early followers of Jesus would get beaten, they would celebrate. I mean, you read the book of Acts, it's insane. They are like throwing high fives, throwing a party after getting beaten because they were like, oh my gosh, we're going through the same thing Jesus went through. And God has counted us worthy to experience this. We're suffering for the cause. And so what they had was they had an irrational loss of fear. And I see Christians all over the world overwhelmed with fear. Christians' anxiety rates are no different than the world's anxiety rates. We are overwhelmed and consumed by fear. Fear that the world is going to be taken over by whatever party. Fear of that the church is losing its voice. Fear of what's being taught in our schools. Fear. The early church didn't fear. They had an irrational loss of fear. It was crazy. So much so that the people were like, man, no matter what we do, if we beat them, their faith seems to get stronger. What is going on? And so I just think if we are a praying people and we trust God and we go ahead and join this movement of irrational loss of fear, I just have a feeling that the church could be this beautiful description of what Jesus and his early followers called a city on a hill. salt and light, a place of hope. And it begins, I just think, with those two things, a loss of fear, an irrational loss of fear, and a praying people. And man, God is good and we can trust him. And good things are coming and we don't have to be afraid. Just a couple thoughts to close our time. Yeah.
Well, that was worth the whole conversation there. That was awesome. You've shared so many wonderful things, but I'm just going to sit in that for a while and pray on that and think about that and share that every chance I get. You may have given me our next sermon series and,
there you go.
And ideas of drawing the church to that. So, but hey, it is awesome to talk to you and to meet you. We've never met in person, but it's good to talk to you. And thank you so much for taking time to sit and share and talk with us. Can you let us know a little bit, maybe where we can get in touch with you if someone has questions or just want to follow you or get books or wherever, just some of the ways we can get in touch?
Well, let me just say, I have loved our conversation. This has been so much fun and I'd love to do it again. You can follow me on Instagram it's at Real Brock Morgan. Somebody took at Brock Morgan. Can you believe? So I'm the real one, at Real Brock Morgan. And I'm on Twitter at Brock Morgan. And of course I'm on Facebook. You can look me up at brockmorgan.com. And if you're wanting to read a book, there's information on my website. And also if you wanted to, get in contact me, you can through the website, brockmorgan.com.
And the books are through the Youth Cartel, or are they all through the Youth Cartel? Or
no,
I know the first ones were.
I've written for a couple different publishers, but all that information is on my website. Yeah. I've got a new one coming out the fall of 2022 called The Anxious Teen. And so I'm excited about that one. That will be for adults who really are seeing what's going on with anxiety levels among teenagers and what we can do about it.
Yeah. Well, I definitely look forward to that as well. And like I said, I would love another conversation at some point.
Yeah, let's do it.
We'd love to pick your brain on much more. So with that, though, I just want to say thanks, and we'll talk to you again, hopefully soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Man, that was great. You said it was good, but I didn't even understand how good that could be. So, hey, thanks everybody for joining us today. We hope you were encouraged and inspired by this week's episode and that you found tools that you can use as you pour into the lives of your students and your student ministry.
Yeah, if you enjoyed this and found it helpful, we ask that you would leave a comment and a rating on whatever platform you're listening. That helps us move up the ratings and helps us be known by more and more people. We would appreciate that very much. Also, maybe you know someone who would benefit from what we talked about today. Share this with them on social media, tag them, but also make sure and tag us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Talk Student Men. So Brent, you have next week's conversation. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're going to hear?
Yeah, so next week's conversation was actually a really, really fun one because I am interviewing my former associate youth pastor who is actually still volunteering with us to this day. And her name is Bailey Avery. And so she is going to sit down and talk a little bit with me about how to leave well. And we will talk a little bit about the importance of leaving well. And then we're also going to go into specifically her situation of how do you step down from a position where you are the paid person to do the job, and how do you gracefully transition into an opportunity to where you're the volunteer now and you have to divert and you have to make sure that the kids are giving proper attention and respect to the leader that is above you now.
Wow, that's awesome. And I think this will be a great conversation, not only for youth leaders, but maybe to share with people who they work with, or even some college students who are looking at going into youth ministry. So I think this will be an awesome episode, and I hope that you are all looking forward to that as well. Just as a reminder, go to studentministryconversations.org and you can find show notes and links from this episode. Just search for this week's episode number in the search bar. There's also lots of other helpful articles and posts and blog posts as well. We encourage you to go and catch back up on this podcast if you have just started joining us. We have 9 or 10 other episodes that are waiting for you. Again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
See you guys next week.